From this Sunday, it will be illegal to meet up with more than 6 people, even if you're outside and the wind is blowing. That is, of course, unless your boss has ordered you to. Is it sustainable for the government to tell people that you have to traipse into work on public transport and spend all day in a room full of people, but if you want to go for a drink afterwards or even go to the park for lunch, that would be not only ill-advised, but against the law? Can this particular form of social contract sustain itself? Also, does the need for new restrictions show that the government has lost control of COVID-19? That's the big story I'm going to be discussing today with Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing very well, Michael. How are you doing?
Very well. It's nice to be back with sort of a big day, 2 big stories today. Over the summer, obviously, sometimes you have to sort of look a bit deeper. What are we going to lead the show with today? Today we had 2 strong contenders. Because what also happened today was the government published their internal market bill, which, as they admitted yesterday, is going to break international law. They're no longer denying it. They're saying, yep, it's going to break international law, but we're going to go for it anyway. Massive story, which is going to take up the second half of this show. Before we get started, of course, as ever, tweet on the hashtag Tysky. We'll go to your questions and your comments throughout the show and share the stream with your friends. We need everyone to know that we start at 7 p.m., not 8 p.m. now. First story. Today was the return of the Downing Street daily press briefings, although I think this is a one-off, so I suppose just a Downing Street press briefing. Boris Johnson here announced new restrictions to try and prevent a second coronavirus spike.
In England, from Monday, we're introducing the rule of 6. You must not meet socially in groups of more than 6, and if you do, you will be breaking the law. This will apply in any setting, indoors or outdoors, at home or in the pub. The ban will set out in law and it will be enforced by the police. And anyone breaking the rules risks being dispersed, fined, and possibly arrested. This single measure replaces both the existing ban on gatherings of more than 30 and the current guidance on allowing 2 households to meet indoors. Now you only need to remember the rule of 6.
The rule of 6. It has replaced their far more confusing rules as they were before. We're going to discuss in a moment, did they need to be as confusing as they were? Because lots of people are saying, it was the lockdown, it was easy to give clear messaging because there was a simple scientific message to be given. It was inevitably going to be ambiguous when the science got more complicated. I personally disagree with that. But first of all, I want to talk about why these new restrictions are coming into place now. And they were developed by Chris Whitty in that press conference. But I'm just going to nick his slides and explain them to you quickly now. So of the slides that were shown in that press conference, you could see that the confirmed cases, can we get up image 1? So this is the number of confirmed cases. You can see there is a spike towards the end of August. I don't know if we can call it the eat out to take out spike. It does seem strange that in exactly the period they were telling everyone, go out, shop, go to businesses, socialize in public places. Now we've seen a bit of a spike, potentially not a surprise. And the next slide breaks it down by age. So we've heard the government sort of saying that this is especially because of people in their 20s. That is borne out in the data. And so you can see there that it's especially among people in their between 20 and 29 whose incidence of coronavirus is increasing. Also people in their 30s and teenagers. The next slide shows us that this isn't just because people are getting tested more frequently. So the ratio of tests which are coming out positive instead of negative, obviously, is increasing. So that shows this isn't just about the fact we're testing more people. There are genuinely more people with coronavirus. And we can then look at the test positivity by age and see it's going up, particularly among people between 17 and 21. So this is a breakdown, a more granular breakdown of age groups. And then finally, because comparisons are back now, apparently, now that we don't have to look at the death chart, which shows that Britain performed worse than every other country in Europe, which sort of dramatically disappeared when the government didn't like showing it us anymore. They found one that does make us look like we're doing not too badly. This is adjusted to show sort of when each of the European countries they've chosen were in their troughs. And this shows that the UK is on a similar trajectory as France, which now has over 50 cases per 100,000 people every week. And you can see that the UK was the blue line, and Spain was doing particularly badly. As the UK only like to show us comparisons when it makes us look good, they haven't included Italy, which has actually managed to keep a lid on coronavirus more successfully than ourselves. Aaron, I'm going to go to you for all of your thoughts on this. I suppose, first of all, do you think it is going to hold? Do you think that the government can plausibly tell people, no, you cannot go and have lunch with your workmates, even if you sit next to all of them? If you sit with 7 people, you have to leave 1 in the office before you go and have your M&S pasta salad.
I mean, people just aren't going to adhere to it, are they? And all the enforceability, like you say, if it's 7 of you, how are the police going to enforce that? How stringently? Again, it does seem to boil down significantly to self-enforcement. To what extent are people going to internalise these rules? Many people will, but as we saw earlier this year, that's probably inadequate if you're trying to actually deal with a potential pandemic. And like you said, there's a delay on these things. And we know with regards to the asymptomatic nature of COVID-19, we know with regards to the incubation period, we might be in for trouble that is already inevitable. We don't really know. But it's amazing, isn't it, how quickly the general zeitgeist has changed. A fortnight ago, people was imploring us, please shop till you drop, support. There was even I think it was a week ago, I saw it in the Telegraph, and it was like over the top, and it was somebody going onto a London Underground escalator. Do your bit, go buy a cup of coffee. And it's just changed so quickly. And what that means for me is I'm quite worried, because if the government's messaging has changed that rapidly, that would indicate one of two things. Either they haven't got a handle on the situation altogether, or they actually think something really bad is coming down the line, and this is kind of trying to price it in. It's trying to do a bit of, how can I put this? Management of expectations, right? So, we've introduced this measure, even if, deaths and new cases sort of spiral over the next couple of weeks. It's not good. And I think many people would probably agree with that sentiment.
I mean, I think the important thing to say here is that the reason why the policy doesn't seem that coherent is because the government aren't being particularly honest about why they're doing the things they're doing. So you look at this and you're someone in your 20s, and what they're saying is the things that people in their 20s normally do, you shouldn't do. So people in their 20s, what do they do? They don't eat out as much as people in their 30s, but what they do have is house parties. They have less disposable income normally. And the government are trying to say, it's particularly those house parties which are the problem. So it's particularly people in their 20s who are the problem. But the problem here, and again, it comes down to, I think, behavioral science, which they've often been told, or we've been told they are following when they come up with their coronavirus policy, but has often seemed incredibly thin, which is that if you want people in their 20s to stop doing the kind of things which they normally do, if you want them to make a particular sacrifice, you have to show that other people in society are making a sacrifice. And when you have a government saying it's your moral duty to go out and get cut price meals, and when you have the government saying it's your moral duty to get on the train and go into work, then of course, people in their 20s aren't going to think, okay, well, everyone else is going to pubs and going to their workplaces, but we should still, for some reason, even though we've been told that coronavirus isn't going to affect us particularly badly. I mean, some people it does. Some people get long COVID, where you sort of have kind of chronic fatigue for quite a while, but they've been told quite rightly that they're less likely to die from it. They're being asked to make a sacrifice, while the government is telling people to arbitrarily go into work to save sandwich shops, to arbitrarily go and get cut price meals, even if you'd happily get a takeaway. So if you want younger people to make a sacrifice in an incredibly formative period of their life, you have to demonstrate that other people are as well. And the government has done the precise opposite, because they're not being led by public health. They're being led by a desire to prop up commercial landlords and prop up people who run basically businesses that don't add that much value to the economy, sandwich chains, etc., and which pay incredibly badly. And I think one problem the government have had throughout all of this is they have made policy as if people are stupid. And people in their 20s can see what's going on. They're not going to be committed to a government policy and willing to make sacrifices if they can see that the government's priorities are completely back to front. And I think that is what's been happening.
And also, people would say, as you outlined at the beginning of this section, 8 people, we couldn't, Novara Media can have a business meeting in a park, and presumably that's fine, we're a workplace. But 8 friends can't meet up and do the precise same thing and just have a conversation. The reason being, why is that? Is because they can't allow business to be hit. And intuitively, most of us would say, well, that's just not fair. But we have an economy, like you say, so fundamentally built on unproductive parts of work, rentierism. We talked about that last time I was on here with you. You know, actually, a lot of big businesses, big capital, doesn't want to end the lockdown, right? They've got contingency plans. They want long-term survival. They're willing to say, look, we're perfectly happy to have zero growth, even lose money for 2 years and come out of this the other end. The people that have a problem with this are the Alan Sugars of this world, the big commercial landlords. He's saying he's up shit creek without a paddle because of what's going on. Them and, like you say, coffee chains. And we should have said 2-3 months ago, I personally think it should have been the leader of the Labour Party, the union movement, and they should have said, look, what are our priorities? We should open schools up. Absolutely. We have to do that. Young people need to go back to university. Clearly, people in critically important sectors of the economy, they need to go back to work too. Nobody disagrees on that. But you know what's going to have to take a hit? Office workers. We're going to have to encourage remote working. You know what's going to take a hit? Prep, pubs, hospitality. Sorry. And we'll extend a big government stimulus package to those organizations, not Prep necessarily, but you know, you might extend furlough, for instance. We haven't had that conversation. And I mean, it's just crazy. And you said it months ago. You said, look, it's additive. This is a zero-sum thing. We cannot do one thing which allows us to do something else. We want to send kids back to school, really critically important, right? But we can't do that and encourage people to have, 50% off a meal up to £10 down their local Indian takeaway, right? It's ridiculous. And it was always a disastrous way of managing a huge public health problem. And what's remarkable is, right at the beginning of the crisis, you were one of the kind of Cassandras of this whole thing, one of the siren voices. At the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, you were saying, this is going to be really bad. You got on top of the science really quickly, and even for me, you really explained it to me very lucidly. And the establishment, the political class, much of the media, was kind of like a month late to that. And it feels like they've just done the same thing all over again. Like they sort of lulled themselves into this strange sense of false security where people were saying, oh, well, there are no more deaths now. It's over. It's finished. And this wasn't somebody who wasn't in receipt of all the information. That's backbench MPs. That's influencers. That's conservative outriders. That's journalists. And the worst thing is, if this is a repetition of what we saw in March, April, I mean, how well prepared are we? Test and trace, how robust is it? We don't really know. I guess we're about to find out.
I mean, we're going to talk about testing in a moment, actually. But I was listening to John Edmonds. He was speaking on what's it called? The afternoon show on Today with Evan Davis. I think it's called PM. That's what it's called. And he was saying, he was asked, are we going to see a spike that is similarly severe as we saw at the start of the year? And he said, no, because we're not going to allow that to happen again. So his worst case scenario is we just go into a lockdown, but we'll go into it earlier because, people are not going to tolerate the kind of 1,000 people dying a day that we did back in earlier in the year because people have seen the damage that inaction actually causes. But what I find most frustrating, I suppose, is how easy a ride the government have got when it comes to their mixed messaging. And this is because, often people say, the messaging now is mixed because it's inherently complicated once you've gone out of a full lockdown to explain to people how you can do some things but not other things. It's not all or nothing now, so people are inevitably going to be confused. And I've heard outriders say that all day on the radio because no one denies now that the messaging isn't confused. They just say it had to be that way. And the reason why I think that is bullshit is because there is a simple message that the government could have given back in April and May, when the most severe phase of the lockdown was easing, which they could have kept all the way from then until now, and it could have been the most humane outcome, and it could have been the one which was best for our public health, which is to say, only do things if you need to do them. And because people quite rightly say we shouldn't scare people to stay in their homes because people are suffering from mental health difficulties, people are suffering from loneliness. But perfect, that's why you say only do stuff if you need to do them. If you're feeling incredibly lonely and you need to go out and see someone who's part of your support network, do it. If kids need to go and get their education in schools, do it.
Yeah.
If you don't need to go and get an Indian in a restaurant and you'd be happy to get a takeaway, get the takeaway. Don't go into the restaurant. Very simple message. And it would have been incredibly, I think, the public aren't dumb. They could have understood that. But instead, the government said, go get your curry. Now it's your moral duty to get on the train at rush hour and go to work, even if you work more productively at home and you're having a meaningful time with your family.
Well, this weekend. The Sunday Times a couple of days ago was saying commuting's good for you. It's bad for the environment, we know that. It's bad for productivity, we know that. It's bad for mental health, we know that. It's a literal waste of your time. I mean, come on. Unbelievable. And the thing is, Boris Johnson a few months ago, right at the start, was saying the British people will use their common sense. Yeah, by and large, that's true and that's good. What's common sense about allowing me to get a half-price sandwich and cup of coffee at Pret if I sit in, but I can't get it if I take away? Where's the common sense in that? I mean, it's the opposite of common sense.
We're going to go through some questions. Lots of super chats coming in. Thank you very much for those. Shailendra Singh says, given how flagrantly the face mask rule is being flouted, at least in supermarkets going by my personal experience, do you think the government really believes this new restriction will be respected? My answer to that would be, I mean, I suppose it depends where you are. I mean, where I am in East London, I mean, I'm definitely seeing people wear masks much more than they did. I think at least, 50, 60% of people in shops, especially in supermarkets, are wearing them. So I do think people are willing to follow the guidelines. I don't think the issue here is that we need more enforcement. But the issue is people will only follow the guidelines if they can see the logic to them. And I think with masks, people can see the logic to them. The government, obviously they took their time and they messed up the messaging over the first 3 months. But since then, they've basically said, if you wear a mask, you'll make other people more safe. And now more people wear masks. And the issue there is that it's a clear, coherent message. There's no contradictions. They're not saying wear a mask unless your boss likes to see your smile. If they were to say that, then I think people would probably stop wearing their mask, which is essentially what they're saying when it comes to social contact. Also, thank you for the tenner. I didn't say that originally. Right, we're going on to our next story, very much related. Especially related to the spike we're seeing in the spread of coronavirus, which is that the testing system, which we were told was going to be world-beating, sucks. So Britain's testing system remains on the brink of collapse, with people in vast swathes of the country not having access to tests and others being told to travel over 800 miles if they want one. The issue was the focus of today's PMQs, with Starmer using all 5 of his questions to ask about testing. Let's take a look at the first exchange he had with Boris Johnson at today's Prime Minister's questions.
Yesterday I spoke to a mum who lives in London. She's got a 4-year-old daughter who had a very high temperature yesterday morning. She phoned 111 and was told to get a test. She tried to book and was told the nearest was Romford. That was 9 o'clock in the morning. She explored that, but there were no tests there. She was then told Haywards Heath, halfway to Brighton. On exploration, no tests there. By lunchtime, this mum was told the nearest place was Telford or Inverness. A slot became available in Lee Valley in the afternoon, one slot, but unfortunately that was being offered across the country, including to people in Manchester, and it was impossible to book. 9 o'clock last night, she was told the nearest centre was Swansea. This is frankly ridiculous. Who does the Prime Minister think is responsible for this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, clearly I take responsibility, as I have done throughout, for the entire handling of the coronavirus crisis. But I would just say to those who attack NHS test and trace and those who deprecate the efforts of the people who are doing their level best to keep us safe, Mr. Speaker, that it is precisely because of the success of test and trace that capacity has gone up to from 2,000 a month in March to 320,000 a day. And we know, thanks to NHS test and trace, in granular detail, in a way that we didn't earlier this year, Mr. Speaker, about what is happening with this pandemic.
Now, I don't know where that figure came from. He says we have the capacity to do 320,000 tests a day. Now, if you say that's the capacity you have, that means if 320,000 people ask for a test that day, they can get one. Now, what we know is that as of 6 days ago, I don't think they're publishing their daily tests anymore now, but the BBC reported as of 6 days ago that the average daily number of tests was 170,000. So if we're at the collapse, if the system's at near collapse because too many people are requesting tests when only 170,000 are being done a day, I don't understand how you can suggest the capacity is 320,000 pounds. Not pounds, sorry, 320,000. That's just, you're shifting the meaning of words if you say we've got the capacity to do 320,000, but we can only do 170,000. I mean, a few more things to bring up there. Boris Johnson anytime he's asked a question by Keir Starmer, says, I don't know why you're trying to do the NHS down. I thought initially when I saw that looked a bit cheap and probably people would see through it. Aaron, you sort of mentioned to me before the show that maybe that's an effective strategy from Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I thought Boris Johnson had a really good Prime Minister's questions. That's not to denigrate Keir Starmer. I thought Keir Starmer's style, and I thought his response was really good. Be calm, stick to the questions. And Boris is never going to excel at Prime Minister's questions. But I thought, unlike before recess, he had a plan, and there were a bunch of off-the-shelf responses and frames that he used. So, for instance, any criticism of test and trace is going to be you're criticising the NHS. That's clearly what he's going to say. And I don't think that's wholly ineffective. And also, he's going to keep on pointing to this claim of us having done more tests than any other European country, which is true, right? Well, I think Luxembourg has done more than us. Of course, the questions then are, who are you testing, where, and why? It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most effective way of stopping the spread of this thing. But I thought it was good. I thought it was decent what he was saying, and I think that line is something that Keir Starmer, who's not a confrontational politician, right? If you say this particular thing is failing, and the Prime Minister retorts, "You're now attacking the NHS, this sacrosanct institution," which Labour, more than any other political party, sort of claims to be not just the parents of, but the kind of almost the sort of the carrier of the flame. The Labour Party always knows secretly what's best for the NHS more than any other party. You're now attacking it, and I think that could be effective.
I mean, I think the thing you bring up that actually Britain is doing quite a lot of tests now. I think that is the kind of the government should be crowing more about that, because what we are seeing is instead them giving these completely bizarre excuses for the problems that are going on. If you said we're actually doing lots of tests, but yeah, these problems are happening and they're happening because of these failures, which we're going to resolve, I think people would respect them. But to say, one, we're doing more tests than anyone else, and any of your complaints are complete bullshit and nonsense, shut up. It just seems to me an unnecessary risk to take on their part. I want to go to a clip of Matt Hancock this morning, who, when it comes to the huge delays and people being told to travel 800 miles to get a test, which is obviously not the sign of a functioning system, he explained to Kay Burley what he thought the problem was.
We saw a story just on Twitter yesterday, 250-mile round trip to Leicester is the closest place for a gentleman who needs a COVID test because he lives with his elderly parents. Many other people, one of my producers this morning checked on the website, he can't actually get a test because it says the service is currently very busy. It's failing. You have to accept that at this stage, the test and trace is failing. And as far as testing for COVID is concerned, what do young people do if they need to have that test, if they want to be responsible, as you say?
I completely reject that, the fact that it's that accusation. In fact, quite the contrary. And if I just set out why, firstly, we have the biggest testing system per head of population of all the major countries in Europe, and we've built it essentially from scratch. Right now, we have the highest capacity for testing that we've ever had. It's increased compared to last week. And that testing means that we can find these cases and therefore help to keep the virus under control with the contact tracing system as well. However, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen an increase in demand, including an increase in demand from people who are not eligible for tests, people who don't have symptoms. You are eligible for a test if you have symptoms of coronavirus or if you have a very specific reason otherwise. And I've been looking into this, including since we talked about it last week, and we have seen an increase, and about 25% of people who are coming forward don't have symptoms and aren't eligible, don't have a reason.
So again, there's clearly a problem. People who have COVID symptoms and want to test in many parts of the country can't get that test. And what is the government's explanation? It's not that anything they could have done was possibly mistaken. It was that everything they've done is right. They've built all of this fabulous capacity, but everything the public has done is wrong. The problem is that too many people are going to get coronavirus tests when they don't actually have symptoms of coronavirus. Now, you might ask, why would people be doing this? Why might people think that you would be entitled, and it's a good idea, in fact, to get a coronavirus test, even if you're not sure you have one of the three main symptoms for the virus? Let's take a look at a clip of Matt Hancock less than 2 months ago. This is a video he tweeted out from his own account.
If you have symptoms, if in doubt, get a test, because that is the most important thing that you can do to help control this virus across the country.
if in doubt, get a test. And now I actually know from personal experience, I'm sure many of you are the same. You have people who have some symptoms which aren't one of the main three, but they think, I am unusually tired at the moment. I am unusually, maybe I've got a bit of people who just feel off and they say, I feel like I've never really felt before, but it doesn't fit into any of those three. And if you'd watched that video by Matt Hancock that said, if you have any doubt, get a test. And these are people who clearly have doubts, and in good faith, they're going to get a test. And Matt Hancock, if he stood up there and said, maybe we were too forthcoming, actually, maybe we encouraged people too much to go and get tests. No, but he makes it seem like a moral failure of the public that they went to get tests in circumstances where he told them to get tests. I mean, you might also remember back in April and May when the number of people being tested wasn't rising, and Matt Hancock kept blaming a lack of demand. There's not enough demand. We're actually making the capacity, but not enough people are asking for tests. So you have 3 months of them saying, get a test, get a test, get a test. Any doubts, get a test. Now suddenly the system is breaking down and they're saying, the problem is all of these people who weren't supposed to get tests, getting tests.
They contrive these bizarre stories. So one is, for instance, that apparently school children en masse are getting tested. There's stories of entire schools getting tested, and it's the sort of talking point I can just see Harry Cole saying on a newspaper review show on the BBC or on Sky, and people say, well, of course, look, the government's trying their best, the testing is really good, but it's being ruined. Again, any success is the result of the government, the public sector. Any failure is privatised, it's down to individual responsibility. And that's what you'll see here. These few terrible rotten apples ruin it for the rest of us. And it works. And if people think I'm sort of being a bit of a Cassandra here, I'm being negative. This is basically how the Tories have managed to ruin and wreck public service provision in this country, often with the consent of much of the British electorate, the best part of 10 years. And so, I think it's going to be very easy for them to lay blame at the door of various individuals and then take responsibility for the success. Like I say, and people are saying in the comments when I said, well, any attacks on testing capacity by the Labour Party will be presented as attacks on the NHS. People are saying, but it's actually Serco. I mean, yes, it is, but look, where does Serco end, and where does Capita end, and Sodexo end, and where does the NHS begin? That's sadly, again, another thing that the sort of consensus between the two major parties in this country have both bought into over the last 20, 30 years. It's been very hard for Labour to extricate themselves from it.
We've got one more coronavirus story for you. Before we go to that, we've got 1,500 watching. We want to get to 2,000 before we end tonight's show. We've still got the whole issue of the British government breaking international law, admitting they were doing so. So get your friends to tune in before we get to that. There was some worrying news broken overnight when it was announced that the trial which AstraZeneca and Oxford are doing into their vaccine, it's supposed to be the leading candidate to be a successful coronavirus vaccine, had to be paused. Now, it had to be paused because someone who was participating in that trial has had serious adverse health effects. Now, at this stage, at this stage, we don't know precisely why that is. It could be an adverse effect caused by the vaccine, or it could just be that someone has an unexplained health condition whilst taking the vaccine. But basically, the whole trial has to be paused until that can be found out for obvious reasons. If someone's had a serious adverse effect, you don't want to trial it in more people's. You don't want to jab it in more people's arms. Apparently, this is kind of normal, so it doesn't necessarily mean this vaccine isn't going to work, because we're in a phase 3 trial now, which means the whole point of this is that you are testing this vaccine on tens of thousands of people. And whilst when they originally tested it on 100 or so people, you saw people with modest side effects. I think most people sort of had a kind of a fever, but obviously a less severe one than actually coronavirus gives you. When you give it to tens of thousands of people, you find the rare adverse effects. Maybe it's going to be the case that this person had, something about their particular health that meant they should, in future be excluded from taking these vaccines. It's too early to say. But what we do know is that this is severely going to delay the vaccine from what we were originally told in certain news reports when it would come about, when this coronavirus crisis would end because the vaccine would magically appear. And one news organisation, which sort of told us with great fanfare that this was... Oh, actually, first of all, no, let's get this statement from analysts at Shore Capital. This is sort of pointing out that it's going to take longer than we originally thought. So the trial was expected to read out by November as an upper estimate and potentially in the next few weeks. However, any suspension to the trial is likely to lead to delays in these timelines. So basically, yeah, just sort of echoing what I was explaining then. In terms of how this differs to what we were told earlier in the year, let's get up this BBC article from back in May, which sort of got many of our hopes up. They said, coronavirus, AstraZeneca ready to supply potential vaccine in September. And you might look at that and you think, oh, what's changed? How are the BBC able to report that AstraZeneca were ready to supply potential vaccine in September? I went back to that article, read it. It was purely based on a press release from AstraZeneca, right? So, and this to me sort of points out what has been a big problem in the mediatization and the coverage of coronavirus, which is that all of the experts have been saying, yes, it takes a long time to make a vaccine, so you should be getting ready for the long haul. AstraZeneca released a press release saying we're going to get it done in September. Obviously, there's a huge race among all of these massive pharma corporations to try and make out they're going to be the first. Because what does it do if people believe they're going to be the first? Their stock price rockets. And AstraZeneca's stock price has rocketed. It actually fell since this trial has been paused. But, over the course of this crisis, and especially since it was sort of announced to be the favorite to be the first vaccine, a lot of people made quite a lot of money then. And I think if you have people like the BBC just uncritically reporting the fact that AstraZeneca is going to be ready in September, even though they haven't got any independent experts to say that, they're just, copying a press release from AstraZeneca. I think that's a real worry, and that is going to, undermine people's faith in the press when it comes to this. And people's faith in, the press when it comes to coronavirus is going to be kind of important when it comes to the vaccine, right? We want people to believe that this is working and that people aren't just being sold, or that a press release isn't just being repeated by our national broadcaster to line the pockets of shareholders of big farmers. Now, when the BBC reports on the effectiveness of the vaccine, I doubt that's going to be the story. I'm not going to be here telling people, the only reason they're telling you the vaccine works is to line the pockets of big pharma. But for us to have, or for people who are more skeptical than myself about this particular issue to have confidence, we need to see that our journalists aren't willing to just, type out in different words the press release that a big pharma corporation has just sent out to all journalists, which makes them look really bloody good.
Well, I think just like with Brexit, the BBC's not really covered itself in much glory in this particular instance, precisely for the reason you've said. It's about the fact that they don't really have the resources to cover these things properly. It's about the fact that you're having to get out 3-4 stories a day as a journalist. But The Guardian's done a good job, I think. The New York Times has done a good job. You can get really high quality information from those two publications. But with the BBC, you might get a push alert or a headline saying, AstraZeneca says they can do something by October.
Well, it didn't even say AstraZeneca says. It says AstraZeneca ready to do this. If they'd written AstraZeneca says, it would have been a better piece of journalism.
And there's good social science out there actually about the extent to which people just read the headline and not the rest of the article. So the BBC, given its huge, completely asymmetric share of the market, like we've talked about it so many times, 70% of radio news, 70% of TV news, huge share of online news market share in this country. They have an extra responsibility not to be so remiss in terms of not covering this properly. And like you say, I think right now it's 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people wouldn't take a vaccine if it was available, which actually I'm surprised it's that good. And that would probably be adequate. That would be sufficient. But you do hear, and I've been hearing quite credible sort of podcasts, people in the US, people who are otherwise intelligent saying, I wouldn't want to be among the first people to take that vaccine. And you think, actually, in the absence of high quality information, that's not a totally unreasonable thing to say, right? I would. Right, because I believe in the review processes of these organisations, and they've had recently. Actually, it was AstraZeneca, it was GlaxoSmithKline, and I think it was Pfizer. The 3 big Anglo-American ones basically said we are not going to cut corners in terms of our review process to get this out, and we're going to make sure there's no problems with it. And in a way, this is a good story. We don't want them to rush it. We don't want something like thalidomide, for instance, in the 60s, people rolled out a drug with incredibly negative side effects, which they weren't aware of. If it means we have to wait an extra 6 months, year, 2 years, so you don't have millions of unnecessary deaths, that's good. And it's great it's been highlighted. But I think, like you say, the big takeaway from this story is media, particularly the BBC, because Guardian, NYT, very strong, aren't covering this with the precision and, dare I say, the forensic detail it deserves.
We've got a comment which is interesting, raises an interesting point. Len S. Grinder tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. If it were only ill people who spread the virus, we wouldn't need a test and trace system to control it. The vast majority of the spread is via A and pre-symptomatic people, hence the need for regular testing of the public to stop outbreaks. We've known this for months. Yep, that's absolutely true. And I think that is actually part of, the government have now announced they're going to do this moonshot campaign to try and get people instant saliva tests so that we can sort of test millions of people a day, which would sort of solve that particular problem. I think there is a kind of genuine logistical problem in terms of how many tests any country has managed to do, at this point in time. And obviously we were late to the game. Countries like Korea and Germany were quick to it. But there doesn't seem to be any country in the world which is able to basically mass test everyone. And so you can see why they have decided to prioritize symptomatic people, because even though pre-symptomatic people will get through the net, less people with coronavirus will end up passing it on. And also the test and trace system is supposed to partly deal with that. What I would say, though, is why we are in a situation where pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission is going to be such a big problem is precisely because the government have encouraged people to go out and start living life kind of as normal. Said, go back into the pubs, go back into the restaurants. If they had said to us all, only do stuff if you need to do it, then we would all be having less contacts, a similar number of contacts to that which we had back in May, instead of the spike that we're seeing in August, because everyone's been encouraged to go and do social things. The reason the testing system is collapsing is because people are socializing. They're socializing because the government told them to, and now the government are blaming them when they feel like they're taking reasonable precautions, which is that if they feel a bit unwell, they're really worried, about making people around them sick as well.
This is the third zoonotic coronavirus this century, right? There's been MERS, there's been SARS, both of which have a higher fatality rate. But I think between them, they've had about 10,000 fatalities. These two other big coronaviruses this century. COVID-19 has a lower fatality rate of only around 1%, maybe even lower. We don't really know. And yet we've had 800,000 deaths. We've had 30 million cases. Now, Ebola has a 50% fatality rate. Coronavirus, yes, okay, it's only about 10 times more dangerous than your average flu. But the point is, it's asymptomatic for many, many people. The point is, it has this terrible incubation period, which actually can be for several days before you have symptoms. So these two things combined mean it's a nightmare to control, even if it doesn't kill most people. And it feels like, again, the government's just kind of ignoring all this. And we're saying, well, look, the curve right now is we're looking at circa 3,000 new cases a day. We don't know. And you're saying, well, they say that they'll get back on top of it again. To get back on top of this, the first time round took action of such a nature we've never seen before in advanced societies. We've never seen weeks or months-long lockdowns. People had to stay in their homes. We've never done it before. And you've achieved all that. You've made this incredible, incredible sacrifice, and it worked. It didn't just flatten the curve, it basically eliminated this thing. And the kind of view is, oh, well, we'll get rid of it, and now we're going to kind of just go back to maybe 20 deaths a day. That's not going to be how this works. Because as we've said, if you've got 40, 50% of people with it being asymptomatic, it's close to impossible to control. I mean, you can minimize it, right, through all the things you talked about, but we're still not having that conversation. Unbelievable.
We're going to move on to the other incredibly big story of the day, a huge one. This would on any other day be leading the show, which is the Tories admitting to breaking international law. Before we do that, make sure you hit the subscribe button, make sure you hit that notifications button so you see every time we go live. On Sunday, the Financial Times broke a story suggesting that the government was ready to break international law by passing a bill which would override the withdrawal agreement. The government spent the following day trying to roll back on that, saying no, they weren't planning to break international law. They were just going to be exploiting ambiguities in the treaty signed with the European Union. However, in Parliament on Tuesday, the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis said the quiet part out loud in response to a question from Conservative backbencher Sir Bob Neill. Neill is chair of the Commons Justice Select Committee. Let's take a look at that Q&A now.
Does he recognise that the adherence to the rule of law is not negotiable? Against that background, will he assure us that nothing that is proposed in this legislation does or potentially might breach international legal obligations or international legal arrangements that we have entered into? And can he answer specifically the other point? Was any ministerial direction given?
I would say to my honourable friend that yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way. We are taking the power to disapply the EU law concept of direct effect required by Article 4 in a certain very tightly defined circumstances. And there are clear precedents for the UK and indeed other countries needing to consider their international obligations as circumstances change. And I would say to honourable members here, many of whom would have been in this House when we passed the Finance Act in 2013, which contains an example of treaty override. It contains provisions that expressly disapply international tax treaties to the extent that these conflict with the general anti-abuse rule. And I would say to my honourable friend, we are determined to ensure we are delivering on the agreement we have in the protocol, and our leading priority is to do that through the negotiations and through the joint committee work. The clauses that will be in the bill tomorrow are specifically there for, should that fail, ensuring that we're able to deliver on our commitments to the people of Northern Ireland.
Yes, we are going to break international law, but in a limited and specific way. I mean, have you ever heard any other politicians say something like that? I mean, obviously we know that politicians are all the time, British politicians, Tony Blair have broken international law, but they wouldn't normally just stand up and say, yes, we're going to break international law. But it's not going to be major.
Well, so maybe Trump would. I can't think of anybody else.
Yeah, it's kind of a Trumpian thing to do.
But he wasn't even luxuriating in it. Trump go, you're damn right I'm going to break international law. Or maybe George W. Bush would have, to be honest, as well. I don't give a rat's ass about.
Well, he didn't when he did it. I don't think he said he was going to break international law. Although I suppose he spent a lot of time trying to undermine the UN, but that's slightly different to sort of breaking a treaty.
There's a thing. Or the US has done it multiple times with various multilateral organisations. So we don't really care about that, But no, in that, and like you said, that particular way. So it was like this quite incredible thing of saying, yeah, we're going to break international law. But it was also, it wasn't even allied to this kind of like populist rhetoric. It was like in a very specific and limited way. What? So weird.
I mean, I suppose it's worth mentioning Brandon Lewis there, used as sort of his justification for it, that this has been done before. He says the 2013 Finance Act also overrode international law. That's very misleading for a number of reasons, because international treaties do often, as times change, unforeseen circumstances come around and people do often change them. But it's only seen to be acceptable if you change them when all other parties to that agreement agree. And so when it came to the act, the sort of tax treaty that this overrode, all of the signatories agreed to it that you needed some modifications because the nature of tax avoidance due to technology has changed. So it wasn't George Osborne standing up there. Obviously, I'm not one to defend George Osborne. I'm just saying this was a bad argument. George Osborne did not stand up there and say, even though the people we signed this treaty with think what we are doing is contrary to the spirit of the treaty, we're going to do it anyway.
This wasn't something that was foisted on Britain. It didn't happen 20 years ago. This is an agreement, the withdrawal agreement, was generated by the Tories, okay, in partnership with Barnier and with Juncker and the various European institutions, but it was a British thing. Less than 12 months ago, right? You just won a mandate from the public in a general election. You won a seat, a majority of 80 seats, saying what a wonderful oven-ready agreement it is. And so it is I think it probably is unprecedented. What other examples do we have? Maybe there's a military sort of neutrality thing which wasn't adhered to, but I don't think anybody, gratuitously said, maybe Britain didn't look after Schleswig-Holstein in the 1860s when, Prussia went to war with Denmark, but Palmerston wouldn't have gone on, yes, we're breaking international law, breaking our agreements. Is there any instance, and I'd love to hear the feedback on this, of a country proposing a piece of legislation, its own piece of legislation, and within 12 months breaking it and saying, yep, we're breaking it? Has that ever happened before? I don't think it has.
I've got no idea, but I would be interested. Put it in the comments if you know of an example where a country who only a year ago signed an international accord said we're openly going to break it. We are going to look now at the content of the bill. So much of this drama happened yesterday. The bill wasn't published until today. It's called the Internal Markets Bill. And I was interested to see, what is the legal mechanism by which you do override international law? I'm not a legal expert, so I'm sort of interested to see what it looks like. It turns out it's much more crude than I thought it would be. So we can look at the relevant section of the Internal Market Bill. And it says, certain provisions to have effect notwithstanding inconsistency or incompatibility with international or other domestic laws. It's basically saying, regardless of inconsistency with international law, will be able to do this. Now, they say further provision related to sections 42 and 43. Now, section 42 gives government ministers the right to decide when export declarations are required for goods going between Northern Ireland and the UK. And section 43 gives the business secretary the power to unilaterally interpret or disapply the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is obviously part of the withdrawal agreement when it comes to state aid. Now, we can see how those sections can be put in place even if they contradict international law. And it says the following have effect, notwithstanding any relevant international or domestic law with which they may be compatible or inconsistent. And it lists all of the sections. It says, accordingly, among other things, regulations under section 42 or 43 are not to be regarded as unlawful on the grounds of any incompatibility or inconsistency with relevant international or domestic law. And it's that second part of the document which I underlined, which I think is most sort of brazen. It's like, why do people bother to study law if you can just put in a bit of legislation? Regulations under this section are not to be regarded as unlawful on the grounds of any incompatibility or inconsistency with relevant international or domestic law. You can basically say, even if this contravenes the law, don't consider it illegal, because we've written in this law that even if it breaks law, it's not illegal. Very bizarre. Even if it contradicts international law, this law says that doesn't matter. Did you know that you can just do that? You can just write a law that says even if it does break international law, even if it's completely counter to a treaty we just signed, this means it's fine. Just seems bizarre to me. I feel like they should have had a more sort of technical solution than just saying, again, the quiet part out loud.
Well, I'm a bit like you. When it comes to international affairs, I have a realist perspective on the world. So I'm kind of not really surprised. And this is really important to point out. People are talking about in the comments. Yes, there are many instances. Obviously, people are talking about people breaking various treaties in war. But World War II isn't that good an example of it, to be quite honest. Actually, World War II is an example of people actually adhering to things they wouldn't generally adhere to. For instance, Britain's treaty with Poland brings them into the Second World War. That's actually quite commendable. That wouldn't normally be. This government certainly wouldn't adhere to something like that. Same with France coming into Poland's aid, or Belgium in the First World War, for instance. Britain joins because, neutral Belgium is invaded. But people are saying, well, there's many instances of countries breaking international law, Tony Blair in Iraq and so on. Fine. Tony Blair and the Iraq War happens in a context we have mass demonstrations on the streets. There is not popular consent for that war. This is the central document of a government which less than a year ago, 9 months ago, went to the polls, got a huge mandate for, and they've then broken it, saying we're going to break it and therefore break international law. I just don't see the precedent. This is not some minor diplomatic treaty. This is not some head of state who's lost the plot, a la Tony Blair, not a head of state, but you get what I'm saying, and doing their thing because they have some messiah complex. This is about an organisation which, the Tory party, which sold this document to the country and now is saying, actually, significant chunks of it are meaningless.
I think the Second World War is actually quite an interesting example because obviously the Nazis very openly went against the Treaty of Versailles. It was part of their whole political sell that we are going to sort of rip it up fundamentally. But also part of their political sell was to say that the people who signed the Treaty of Versailles were traitors and that it was imposed, it was imposed in fairly unjust conditions. Most historians agree the Treaty of Versailles was pretty bad. But
most Brits thought that in the 30s as well.
That was imposed on a country which was, subject to horrendous military defeat, and they were basically, a gun was held to the barrel of the gun was held to their head and say, sign this incredibly unfair treaty. Then 10 years later, a new party comes into power and says it's bullshit. But as you say, Boris Johnson himself signed this deal, said it was a great deal, and now is saying it's a shit deal. We're going to look at some of the justifications for this by the Conservatives. So how have the Tories justified this act of law breaking? So the first, this is from a Telegraph front page, so the Tory paper of choice. They said it's justified because the deal never made any sense in the first place. It goes on to say the Prime Minister believes the UK-EU withdrawal agreement is legally ambiguous and would leave Northern Ireland isolated from the rest of the UK, something that was unforeseen when he agreed to it last year. Now, it was not unforeseen when he agreed to it last year. The whole reason why we had a general election is because the DUP would not back any kind of deal which put a regulatory border in the Irish Sea between Britain and Northern Ireland. The reason they blocked the deal and we had a general election is because they recognised that it would create some isolation of Northern Ireland compared to the rest of Britain. So for now, Boris Johnson said, that was completely unforeseen. It's completely unforeseen.
We spent 6 months last year talking about the backstop. Remember that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole country did.
We half our shows were like, what's the backstop? Okay, how does this work? What does it mean? And many of us thought, look, the Tories really aren't going to be able to get out of this because that was half of Labour's strategy, and ultimately it failed because they said, and it's internally coherent, the Tories can't do this and at the same time claim to be a unionist party because the backstop ultimately means that the north of Ireland is close to the Republic in terms of its trade relations. That's just inevitable because it's going to have a certain proximity to the European single market, that if we're going to have a common shared market across all the nations of the United Kingdom, you can't have both of them, right? That was all we talked about.
Well, that was the difference. So the difference between Johnson's deal and May's deal. So May's deal did protect the integrity of the union, but by doing that, it sort of necessarily subjected Britain to rules and regulations in the European Union. The fallback was for Britain to fundamentally stay in the customs union and something a lot like the single market. The development or the change that Boris Johnson made was he said, fuck it, it's not worth it committing to keep Britain within the regulatory orbit of the EU just so we can create complete, movement between Northern Ireland and Britain. And so that was the change. The change was he sold out the DUP to say that there can be a regulatory border between Britain and Northern Ireland, which, I mean, I don't think that was particularly... That was not my problem with the deal. I think if there's a regulatory border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain, fine. The soft border in Ireland is the priority. But for him to just completely change the story is bizarre.
And also this whole thing of they're window dressing it by saying, actually, it's about state aid. And I've seen some leftists saying, oh, God, because people like you or I are saying, the government, this is ridiculous, right? They're breaking international law, their own agreement. They put this to the people less than a year ago. And we're saying, oh, wow, look, Novara, they're attacking a Tory government that want to bring in, want to be able to assist British industry and contravene European regulations on state aid. Who knew? The kind of spiked critique. You have to be incredibly credulous to believe that's the main problem that the Conservative Party have with this agreement, especially in the context of, look at the stimulus package from France in the context of coronavirus, how much more generous it is than what we're doing. We're not even extending furlough. You have to be so utterly credulous to think, oh yeah, the British government wants to do these huge interventions in the economy the EU simply won't admit. And look, I'm a Eurosceptic. There are really good conversations to be had about that. But look at what Macron's doing right now in France. Look at what we're doing. The Tories don't care less about state aid regulations. This is primarily about Northern Ireland. Why do they care so much about Northern Ireland not being in the customs union? I think because the whole thing is about we need a free trade agreement with the United States, as the leaked documents disclosed by Labour in the final weeks of the general election last year made very clear. A precondition for the US trade representatives with Britain in negotiations, a precondition for a free trade agreement was for no part of the UK to be in the customs union. They explicitly say that. That was what was leaked. But rather than British journalists say this is a hugely important document, a document of public interest, what do they say? Russia. Jeremy Corbyn doing the bidding of Vladimir Putin. Shame on you. Shame on you. Because we have a public now who says, well, the government's saying it wants to break international law, it wants to contravene something which it negotiated less than a year ago. Why is that? Well, we have a pretty good ready-made answer. But rather than actually trying to address it for the last year, rather than talk about the nature of those trade negotiations between Britain and Donald Trump's America, and how the latter wants basically no real deal of any significance between us and Europe to have that free trade agreement, rather than talk about that, you were talking about Jeremy Corbyn being an instrument of the Kremlin. We are so unfortunate to have these people informing our public in this country.
We're going to go on to excuse 2. So excuse 1 was that it was unforeseen. Who could possibly have foreseen that the deal that Boris Johnson signed would create a regulatory border in the Irish Sea? The second excuse is that it was a bit rushed. So this is a government spokesman quoted by Sebastian Payne of the FT. The withdrawal agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol aren't like any other treaty. It was agreed at pace at the most challenging political circumstances to deliver on a clear political decision of the British people. To say it was really rushed, guys. It was agreed really quickly, so it's not actually a proper treaty. Now, I mean, many people at the time made the argument that this was a bit rushed. Boris Johnson called them traitors and said, you have 3 days to pass this or I'm going to expel you from the party, which is what he did, right? So the idea for him to now say, oh, it's not a real treaty because it was rushed. I mean, people at the time knew it was rushed. And then the third one, which is probably the most offensive one, really. This was used by Matt Hancock on the Today programme this morning, so on Radio 4. He said the reason the government are willing to break the withdrawal treaty and find themselves on the wrong side of international law is to protect peace in Northern Ireland. Johnson repeated that in response to a question from ITV's Robert Peston. Let's take a look at Boris Johnson at that press conference today.
I have to say, of course, I see it very differently. I see the risk that certain, I think, extreme interpretations of the treaty might place to the peace process in Northern Ireland, to the Good Friday Agreement. Nobody wants to see a barrier down the Irish Sea. So what we're doing, which I think would be very, very injurious, so what we're doing is putting a safety net beneath which things cannot go wrong to protect peace and protect the settlement in our United Kingdom. And that is the purpose of what we're doing.
No one wanted to see a regulatory border down the Irish Sea. Everyone knew that was what you justified it at the time. I'm going to go to you in a moment. First of all, let's go back to Boris Johnson. Because as we've seen, he's saying, the deal wasn't, it was done in a rush. It wasn't very good. It's not even a real treaty. Boris Johnson won a general election campaign on the basis that this deal was a really good deal. In case you don't believe me, watch the man himself.
I do think that this deal represents a very good deal both for the EU and for the UK.
They said we'd never get a deal.
Mr. Speaker, there's a very good deal on the table. On the contrary, we have a fantastic deal. It is there, ready to go.
Isn't the problem, Mr. Johnson, that the DUP, the unionists who were your partners, they agree with him and not you?
Well, they don't actually, because our deal is a great deal. We have a deal that, as I say, is oven ready. It's ready to go. And it's approved, as I say, not just by our friends and partners in the EU, but by every one of the 635 Conservative candidates. And it delivers everything that we wanted from Brexit. Our whole country comes out entire and perfect. England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland together. We have a great deal that is supported, as Mr. Corbyn says, not just by many members of his own party, but by the entire Conservative Party now. And 635 Conservative candidates have backed it. And we have a great new deal that, as I say, is oven ready. Well, we have a deal that keeps the whole of the UK together as we come out of the EU.
We have a deal which keeps the whole of the UK together as we come out of the EU. And 635 Tory candidates were stupid enough to agree to it because Boris Johnson has just realised now that actually when you look at the small print, it actually separates Northern Ireland from Britain. And he's only just realised this. So everything he said back in December, he was either intentionally lying or the guy's an idiot. And everyone who works for him is an idiot.
Could be both.
Could be both.
Could be both.
Lying idiots.
I mean, that was the big takeaway. I remember that it was a horrible night, election night last year. We covered it on Election Sesh here. And my big takeaway, about 6, 7 in the morning, I was going for breakfast. I think I was with Tom Bastani. I was with Medway, James Medway. And I said, you know what? Whatever else we think about this, the union's over, right? I mean, Northern Ireland, how are they going to come through this and potential Irish unification? Scotland, and look, that doesn't mean we get an independent Scotland in 5 years, but clearly there's only one direction of travel here. And it's like, yeah, Boris Johnson 9 months later is like, oops, is that a thing? What are they going to talk about next? Oh God, maybe the Scots might get independence sometime soon. Oh, maybe we should do something about that. It just feels like they're really late to this. I mean, but look, maybe because of COVID, they've been juggling so many things, and I have no idea. There's no rhyme or reason to half of it, but it does feel like, they'll probably be able to get away with it. Like, there is this 40% of the country that probably likes the idea of breaking the law to get back sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, the argument as to why they're not eventually going to go for an ODL, which is quite strong, is that the thing that Keir Starmer's already attacking them on is competence. And after you fucked up coronavirus, do you really want to fuck up getting the deal? And at least if he gets a deal, no one reads the deal really, including Boris Johnson, it seems. But if you can say we got a great deal, then lots of people will believe you've got a great deal.
But equally, and I disagree with that, because equally, there has never been a better time for no deal than coronavirus. You're running a £350 billion deficit. You've got huge numbers of people being laid off. You've got a huge unprecedented GDP contraction. And so if somebody says, well, that business, they've just shut, that's 200 jobs. coronavirus. It's very difficult to discern where does coronavirus end and where does a very bad Brexit deal or a no deal begin. And so I think, I would look at it from the other way round. I think coronavirus actually has turned what would have been a very risky preference. I think it makes it look a lot less risky. You know what? Okay, so we'll lose what? 2% growth as a result of leaving the no deal, 5% growth. Right now, I think we're looking at what? Minus 15% for this year. So I wouldn't be so sure.
We're going to look at one more response to those justifications. This was briefed to Laura Kuenssberg by a former cabinet minister. Let's get up her tweets from today. Coronavirus will dominate headlines today, but former cabinet minister involved in putting together the EU deal gobsmacked that Hancock said the changes to withdrawal bill were about the peace process this morning. And this is a quote from the former cabinet minister. "I cannot allow anyone to get away with saying the government is doing this to protect the peace process. This does the precise opposite. It is about the internal market in the UK and is more likely to lead to a harder border, which will imperil the peace process." Now, I mean, that's a really good point. It's undeniably true. The whole reason why the EU was sort of forcing Britain to make these assurances was to say that in a case of no deal, even in a case of no deal, there will be no hard border in Ireland. That's the only reason why the government of the Republic of Ireland accepted the deal. Now, and that's, that was the most important part of the Good Friday Agreement, really, that you have no border, no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And what Boris Johnson here is doing is saying that we can override that deal, which guaranteed a soft border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, because what's more important is that there is unfettered access between Northern Ireland and Britain. And if there is unfettered access between Northern Ireland and Britain, then obviously for the EU to be able to protect the integrity of their single market so that they're not undercut by goods from outside of it, there will have to be some sort of border on the island of Ireland. So for the government to pretend that they are overriding the withdrawal agreement that they agreed 9 months ago purely to maintain the peace in Northern Ireland is back to front. It's bizarre, it's wrong, and I think it is quite offensive, actually, to sort of play with people's lives like that, to say we are doing this to protect the peace when you are doing precisely the opposite.
That's what they do.
They
lie.
They lie. We're going to go to some super chats before our last section, which is going to be Labour's response, which will also sort of, I suppose, bring us to some interesting conversations about the nature of international law. I'm sure many of our viewers are somewhat sceptical about it to begin with. We have some super chats. Thank you very much. AJ Cam 79 with a $5 super chat. Let's get you to 4K cameras. I thought we were already on 4K cameras, or maybe we've only got one.
No, this platform maxes 1080, but the cameras are 4K.
So the problem is well, anyway.
No, the platform is not the problem.
It can be 4K.
Oh, can it do 4K?
Anyway, sorry,
this is not the problem, though.
This is the kind of incredibly dull conversation that I don't really understand that we should have when we're not on air. Tim Allen with $4.99 says, "Keep up the good work. More power to you." Thank you very much. Very kind. Kim Howard with a $5 simply for Aaron's righteous rant right there. You do a righteous rant so well, Aaron.
Thank you.
Heather Arnold with a $5. Great show as always. Can you wish my partner Rob a happy birthday? We watch every show. Happy birthday, Rob.
Happy birthday, Rob.
I love wishing people happy birthday on the show, especially if they watch it, every time.
The best thing is mean it as well, Michael. You've got a heart that's so full of Michael's got so much to give.
I really do care when it's your birthday, honestly. No, honestly, that sounded insincere then, but I am being sincere. Also, thank you to Trish Fowley with the $4.99 super chat donation. It means the world to us. We are going to go to our final story, obviously related to the first one. It's about Labour's response to the government admitting they are going to break international law. Now, Keir Starmer devoted all 5 questions at PMQs today to testing, but on Tuesday, Lisa Nandy did challenge the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, on the government's admission it was planning to break international law. Let's take a look at her in the Commons yesterday.
In the last 6 months, he has publicly reminded Iran, Israel, China and Russia of their obligations under international law. Mr. Speaker, I agree with him. So does he agree with me and with the most senior legal official in government who has behaved with honour and principle this morning that when the Prime Minister briefs that he will unilaterally tear up our international obligations under the withdrawal agreement. It undermines our moral authority. It harms our national interest, and it makes a mockery of his attempts to stand up for international law. And will he assure this House that he, as the Foreign Secretary, will never vote for amendments which violate our international obligations?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary? I obviously respect all of the brilliant civil servants that work for us. I used to work as a Foreign Office lawyer myself. What I can say to the Honourable Lady is that I'm surprised that she would open up this to question, that we ought to, as we go through the uncertainty of changing our relationship with the EU, make sure that as regards the internal market within the UK, there's maximum certainty for businesses, and of course we will legislate to that effect, and ultimately we will take every measure necessary to protect the integrity of the United Kingdom and comply and live up to and ensure that the Good Friday Agreement is respected. I'm surprised she's not supporting that.
I thought that was very creepy, that patronising. I'm surprised that the Honourable Lady would say this when what we're trying to do is maintain peace in Northern Ireland, even though you're doing the opposite. Very bizarre. Anyway, I want us to focus on Labour's response there. So what Nandi said is she mentions 4 countries, China, Russia, Israel and Iran. And she's saying Dominic Raab in Parliament, in the House of Commons, over the last 6 months, has said that these countries have broken international law and that they shouldn't have done. And her argument is that if you are now standing up and your party, your government is admitting to breaking international law, then what power are those words going to have? So I had a quick look before this, what instances she was referring to. For Iran, I couldn't find something actually since January. So either there's something I didn't find or, the months are slightly out in her speech. And that was that in January, Iranian police detained the UK ambassador for 3 hours after he attended a vigil which became a protest.
Oh, no.
Yeah, well, I mean...
it's not Iraq, is it? It's not war in Iraq and, hundreds of thousands of people dying.
It's not a particularly significant breach of international law. But I mean, in her defense here, the point she's making is that Dominic Raab, she's using the words that Dominic Raab used, which is to say that this country has broken international law and we condemn them. And she's saying, you're not going to be able to say that. We'll talk a bit more about Labour's Atlanticism in a moment because it is an important point. Israel, the example was in August, Raab said annexation of the West Bank would be illegal. China, it's the national security law, which was seen as a breach of the UK-China agreement, that Hong Kong would be governed under one country, 2 systems. And with Russia, it's either the poisoning of Alexei Navalny and with Novichok, or potentially she's referring to Raab's kind of strange claim that the Russian security services... this wasn't about the election. It was that they were stealing research on a COVID vaccine. He did say that was contrary to legal norms. But whilst there were those 4 that she mentioned in Parliament, and they were 4... as I say, because they were ones that Dominic Raab had used. I think we're going to discuss in a moment, whether they are the most egregious examples of a country breaking international law in the last 6 months. They're probably not. But when she tweeted it, she had quite a different message, or at least one of the countries had suddenly been dropped. So when she tweeted that video, and the video we just shown you was a clip from her Twitter feed, she says the actions of China, Russia and Iran are making the world less safe. Now is not the moment to tear up international law. If the government can't be trusted to keep its promises, how can we demand others do the same? And it's interesting how her message in the comments has changed to her message on Twitter. The message in the comments, as I say, I agree with you, Aaron, as we're going to talk about, that these aren't necessarily the most egregious examples of international law breaking, but she's sitting there and saying, Dominic Raab, you said these things are illegal. How can you condemn them for that when you're breaking international law yourself? So there's some defense to that. But then why in the tweet has she just chosen China, Russia and Iran, who she says are making the world less safe, but Israel suddenly gets dropped? Is that because she thinks that when allies of the UK government break international law, it doesn't make the world less safe? Potentially the annexation of the West Bank, in her mind, makes the world more safe. I don't know. They're willing to ignore. Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, I think the whole... Tell me, what international laws has Iran broken? And people say, they had the death penalty for gay people. Yeah, it's disgusting. It's appalling. It has to end. But what international law have they broken? Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, first of all, she's been arrested as an Iranian national. A nation state has the right to arrest its own nationals. That's not contravening international law. Again, it's appalling. She should come back as soon as possible. But they've not broken international law by doing that. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's husband has said he thinks one of the big obstacles to her being released is the fact that Britain won't pay several £100 million that it still owes Iran. So Britain is the law-abiding, upstanding member of the global community. But actually, Iran is the one that breaks all the international norms and laws because they arrested a diplomat for 3 hours. He wasn't even arrested; he was detained. He was never charged with anything. Okay, so I would be interested to see to what extent does that mean his diplomatic community was compromised. I mean, let's be real here. The more powerful you are as a country, generally speaking, the more likely you are to violate international law, because might makes right. And so, yes, you've got Britain, you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got the United States, you've got France historically. But smaller countries tend
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but smaller countries tend not to break international law because they can't get away with it. And so this idea that the international community, we all play by these rules, a rules-based system, it's just not true. It's not true. And we can talk about, of course, the huge historic examples. Iraq, of course. Equally, we could talk about Suez. We can talk about United States intervention. Nicaragua, was that legal? Or Grenada, was that legal? So the idea that or America's persistent attacks on the idea, for instance, of an ICC or the ICJ, I find it almost ridiculous. I saw a great image on Twitter. Somebody tweeted, they said, the international community, and it just showed basically Canada, America, Europe, and Australia, and that's the international community, none of these brown or black countries. And that's not to say many of these countries don't do appalling things. Iran does appalling things all the time. In terms of breaking international law, is it any worse than Britain or America? I actually think it's far better. Look, for instance, the nuclear deal. There was a multilateral agreement on Iran's development, potentially, of nuclear technology. Who broke that deal? It wasn't the Iranians. And nobody thinks they were violating any parts of it. No serious body thinks that. So, I think basically often this just boils down to the people breaking international law. Look, be real. You mean global south countries. That's what you mean. That's what you mean.
I agree with that. This is a very interesting issue. I think this is something we'll talk in more detail about on future episodes of Tysky Sour. For now, that's it for us this evening. We'll be back on Friday, same time, same place. As ever, if you want to support the show, please do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you already do, thank you so much. You make this show and this organisation possible. I've been speaking to Aaron Bastani. I'm Michael Walker. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.